So from the body to the body politic. The great political theorist Frank Zappa once said that in order to be a real country, you needed two things. You needed a national airline, and you had to have a national beer. You might be able to get away without the airline, but you definitely needed the beer. These days, to the list, one would have to add a national constitution. For countries, as they emerge on the world stage, will typically, as one of their very first acts, adopt a new constitution. South Sudan, the world's youngest country, did this on the very first day of their independence in 2011. A constitution is a kind of a product that embodies the fundamental values of the people, that provides a blueprint for governance, and announces on the world stage that we are indeed here, that we are indeed a country. One way to examine the emergence of this norm is to look at data, such as that gathered by my colleagues and I at the Comparative Constitutions Project over the last few years. The top line in this figure shows the number of independent countries in the world since 1789. And you can see that that number has increased. It's about 4 or 5 times what it was in 1789. The dashed line indicates the number of countries that have what we could call a discrete national constitution, a single document. And the interesting thing is that over time, those two lines converge, so that by about 1950, there's certainly a norm that to be a country, you need a constitution. The other thing the figure shows us is the number of constitutions adopted in any given year, given by the bars. That ranges from 0 in some years to more than 20 in others. The interesting thing here is that you can see that constitutions, the quintessential embodiments of national sovereignty, actually come in waves. And these waves tend to follow great international conflicts. So the end of the Cold War, the end of World War II, decolonization, these major transnational events shape the production of national constitutions and trigger their rewriting. One reason there are so many national constitutions is that they tend not to last very long. This would have pleased, actually, our founding father, Thomas Jefferson, who thought, in some sense, that constitutions ought to be rebooted every generation or so. For Jefferson, the dead should never govern the living. And he thought, as a radical Democrat, that each generation had to choose their own institutions. Many said, look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribed to men of the preceding age a wisdom less than human, more than human. This is what he wrote in 1816. He was the man of the previous age. And so he himself had enough awareness to question his own handiwork. On the basis of this theory, he argued that all laws and all constitutions should expire automatically after a period of 19 years. He calculated this based on European life expectancies of the time, and it was the period, by his calculations, in which a new generation would replace a prior one. Through this mechanism, he thought that each generation would choose their own institutions, and that this would somehow lead them to adopt them on the basis of a democratic principle, but also, critically, allow them to update the institutions. As society changes, as technology changes, he thought institutions and laws had to change as well. Now, most countries seem to have followed Jefferson's advice. The United States has not. But this allows us actually to look at trends in constitutional content over time. What are the trends? Just as we have trends in fashion, we have trends in hairstyle, so there are trends in constitution making and constitutional content. What this figure shows us is for each constitution, represented by a dot, the trend in the number of rights that are included in the Constitution. And clearly one can see that we are indeed, in some sense, in an age of rights, of ever-expanding claims of rights. A Constitution adopted today would include rights that Thomas Jefferson and his colleagues never thought of. Rights to health care, rights to a clean environment, even a right to leisure. In this way, ideas about what rights we have are reflected in fundamental law, but only if there's updating and changing. Constitutional texts are also embodiments of economic ideas. And so in this figure, you can see in the blue line the percentage of constitutions, national constitutions, that make reference to the free market, a number that's been steadily increasing since 1940. In the red line, you can see the rise and then the fall of socialist constitutions. And so constitutions also embody ideas about the economy. Another thing we can look at is God's position in the Constitution. In the 19th century, many constitutions would have been promulgated in the name of God. But as you can see, in the long secular 20th century, God suffered a serious decline in popularity. She seems to be making something of a comeback right now. But the point is that we can look at in these documents for shared ideas across countries about what they tell us about the nature of government and the basis of our fundamental institutions. In this sense, we have to reimagine our image of constitution making. Most of us think of constitutions as made by a bunch of men in a New England town hall, reasoning from first principles to optimal institutions. This is not really how constitution making gets done today. Indeed, one would have to describe it as much more of a transnational process. So if one was to go to, let's say, Nepal, which adopted a constitution last year, one would find all kinds of organizations, the logos of which are on this figure, which would show up to work with the national government in terms of what was going to be in the Constitution, in terms of designing its process. Sometimes these organizations have sort of positioned themselves as general advisors. In other cases, they come to lobby for very specific things. The point is that constitution making now is very much a transnational process. And you might think that this is a kind of a bad idea, that it's an interference with the fundamental right of a sovereign people to choose their own institutions. Realistically, though, the people who are actually drafting constitutions, in most cases, have never done it before, will never do it again, are often not paying much attention, and occasionally are so embroiled in their own partisan politics and partisan passions that they can't ever come to agreement. In such circumstances, it might make sense for the international community, broadly defined, to subsidize these processes in terms of helping to structure them, in terms of providing ideas so that that Jeffersonian updating can be better achieved for the benefit of the population that is going to have to live under these institutions. Now, this image here of Nepal might seem to some of you this week as a kind of warning, right? In some sense, it seems to embody the current state of American politics. And for that reason, I want to spend a minute talking about the United States and the implications of the analysis for the United States. In this image, we have two ancient artifacts. On the right, the 229-year-old Constitution of the United States. On the left, the oldest woman ever to live, a woman named Jeanne Calment, who died in France in 1997 at the age of 122 years old. Now, they went to her and they asked, what's your secret? How did you live so long? And she said, I smoked till I was 117. I quit, didn't make me feel any better. I went back to it. Her diet seemed to consist of chocolate by the pound, along with some copious amounts of port wine. I guess the point of the story is that very much like the United States Constitution, this might work for her. It's not necessarily a model for the rest of us. If you are a country that is writing a new constitution, you're unlikely to use that of the United States. But I also think it tells us something about what we would do if, as human beings must all expire, if our Constitution was ever to be replaced. Now, scholars have been talking about this for some time. So many of our institutions seem so poorly fitted for a modern society. The Electoral College will, for many of you, be on your mind this week. The Senate, which seems so undemocratic in so many ways. There's lots of institutions that are problematic from a modern democratic point of view and that would never be adopted today were we to start over. One thing I'm sure of is that if we were to write a new constitution, we would be reflecting the ideas of the accumulated experience of this now 230-year-old era of constitution making. We would look at the experience and the ideas that flow from other countries in order to do a better job of reflecting our current moment. Now, if you're interested more in learning more about constitutions, I have this website, constituteproject.org. You can explore the ideas that are instantiated in national constitutions at your own leisure, and I thank you very much for your attention.